Hello, welcome back to Bebop Review. My name's Andy Shaw. This is the first video in a series on jazz educators. This first one is obviously on George Russell, who wrote the Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organisation. It's been inspired by this video by Adam Neely, question and answer number 10. About 2 minutes and 20 seconds in, this guy, Nick the Bluesman 1, asked this question: what do you think about the idea that jazz is really becoming how to play jazz? Is it me, or is there a larger demand for learning the music than there actually is for the music itself? Adam Neely then goes on to say that there's far too many people coming out of college with degrees in music and not enough work out there for them. But he says, you know, learning jazz is a good thing anyway because you can use it for lots of things, you know, and it's a very rewarding experience learning about jazz. He then goes on to say he doesn't understand why people want to play jazz, which is very strange. That's like saying, why did Goya want to paint the black paintings? You know, it's just a very, very silly answer when art is actually not about playing to an audience, really, is it? Adam Neely himself did a video on the Lydian Chromatic Concept with Rick Beato, where they basically just talk about it. They don't actually teach anything. And some of the interesting things where they have a little debate with each other, Adam Neely cuts it out, and I'd like to have seen that. Neely himself in the video can't even tell us when the Lydian Chromatic Concept was first published.
Lydian Chromatic Concept. It's this theoretical concept that was developed by George Russell, and I think it was the 1950s when he first...
50s, which was 1953, by the way. So I'd kind of like... I lose confidence in Adam Neely when things like that happens. And also, in his video, in the notes below, he actually puts Wikipedia to actually learn about the Lydian Chromatic Concept, which is not very good. I'm telling you, I've told you before that Wikipedia is a very unreliable source of information, so certainly not impressed by this video at all. Neely makes a couple of criticisms of George Russell, but in my opinion, I don't really think he knows that much about the Lydian Chromatic Concept. He doesn't talk with great knowledge about it, and he has a bit of a do with Rick Beato, but we don't hear that, you know what I mean? I don't actually get that he actually really knows it. Somebody came onto one of my videos and made the accusation that Adam Neely really doesn't understand the Lydian Chromatic Concept. And after watching this video, I'm not saying he doesn't, I'm just saying it doesn't come across that he's a big expert on it, you know. So anyway, if you look down this page, we get a lot of comments like this. This is all completely over my head. Yeah, I'm lost, but it's fascinating to watch. Level of musical incompetence of 9,000. A lot of people just don't understand it. It's not just Neely's video, it's lots of videos. People just don't understand it. And the people who are actually teaching about the Lydian Chromatic Concept on YouTube are only giving the very basic stuff of it. They're not going into the depth of it. So I think we're about ready for a reappraisal of George Russell's work. So in this video, I'm going to go into it a little bit more in depth. I don't know how long it's going to take me to finish this series, but I'm going to start off with a biography of George Russell, just to let you know who he is, because a lot of people don't seem to know who he is, looking at some of these comments on Adam Neely's page. And then we'll go into the Lydian Chromatic Concept itself, and then at the end, in part 3, I think we'll look at the legacy of the Lydian Chromatic Concept. Okay, so we'll start off with the biography up to 1953, up to the date that the book was first written. Okay? George Russell was born on June 23rd, 1923 in Cincinnati, Ohio. He never met his biological parents, but learned in his teens that his mother had been an Oberlin college student from a black upper-class Kentucky family, and that his father was a white Oberlin professor. As his mother's family was not supportive of the union, or their daughter raising the baby while in school, the couple did not marry and terminated their parental rights. Russell was raised in Cincinnati by his black adoptive parents, Bessie and Joseph Russell. Bessie was a strong and positive maternal influence in many ways. Social, outgoing, religious and generous, she once provided a temporary home to one of young Russell's schoolmates. Bessie Russell was one of the first black nurses to work for a white doctor in the socially progressive area. She attended church regularly and eventually became involved in what Russell recalls as the mysticism of a religious sect led by the flamboyant bishop Mary Mack. His father, Joseph Russell, worked as a chef on the B&O Railroad and was often away. When home, Russell recounted how his father would entertain himself by singing and playing piano, although he had no formal musical training. Russell said his father played a kind of stride piano while he sang, letting his fingers fall where they may, his right hand hitting very few notes in common with his voice. Cincinnati was an artistically and socially cultured place at this time, considered a Midwestern musical centre. Russell remembers audiences as being educated and critical about music and other forms of art. Cincinnati's German immigrant population contributed to a hearty local appetite for classical church and popular music. The city was also home to a large middle-class African-American population that was also very musical in its churches, popular music venues, and eventually in the downtown jazz scene centered in the historical West End. Cincinnati, Cleveland, and Columbus were considered rising black metropolises during this period of the Great Migration, and each had a black population of over 30,000 by 1930. Russell grew up in and experienced life as a member of this large black population. As a child, he heard bands playing light classical dance and blues music on the famous riverboats that came up the Ohio River from the Mississippi and went all the way to Pittsburgh. Russell's first music teacher was a German organist, with whom he took piano and then drum lessons. Russell later developed his skills as a drummer through Boy Scout and Drum and Bugle Corps to the point where, in his teenage years, he was playing jazz in clubs in the areas around 6th and Mound Streets, as well as across the Ohio River in Newport, Kentucky. In his youth, Russell heard music of the African American church, as well as jazz on the riverboats played by bands including Fate Marabelle, with whom Louis Armstrong had played. He heard the big band jazz of Noble Sissle and experienced the thrill of dance bands at all hours, dawn dancers. Piano giants Art Tatum and Fats Waller were both known to Cincinnati jazz audiences in the 1930s, and Russell heard them in person as a young man, even singing with Waller at the age of 7. His neighbours included the arranger Jimmy Munday, who wrote for Benny Goodman at the time. Once, when 6 members of the Duke Ellington Orchestra needed a place to stay after a performance in nearby Dayton, Russell and his mother obliged them at their home. By his teenage years, Russell was aware of a whole world of music and increasingly the exciting new music of jazz. In 1938 to 39, Russell began to attend Wilberforce University, 20 miles east of Dayton, on scholarship. Founded in 1856, Wilberforce is the oldest historically African American university in the United States and was a stop on the Ohio Underground Railroad. Musical tradition was strong at Wilberforce, whose famous musical alumni included William Grant Still, Horace Henderson, Benny Carter, Ernie Wilkins, Coleman Hawkins, and Ben Webster. Russell played drums in the university's jazz band, the Wilberforce Collegians, a stepping stone in the careers of many jazz musicians and composers. The Collegians played the dance band music of the swing era, including many new arrangements written specifically for the group by student composers. After 3 years at Wilberforce, Russell continued to work professionally as a drummer in Cincinnati clubs such as The Bar. He also worked in an elevator in a department store while waiting to be drafted into the Marines in 1941. Eventually, Russell and other musician friends from Wilberforce were tapped by the Marine Corps to serve in military bands and were called to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton. It was there, after working long hours in many places and under strenuous conditions, that Russell failed his military physical examination and was diagnosed with tuberculosis. Uncertain of his fate, he stayed in a branch hospital in Cincinnati for 6 months. There he befriended a fellow patient named Harold Gaston, who taught him the rudiments of arranging, which Russell began to be interested in. Both Russell and Gaston were eventually discharged from the hospital without being fully cured. Returning to work as a drummer, Russell joined saxophonist, composer and bandleader Benny Carter, whom he had met earlier when Carter came through Cincinnati. Carter's swing big band included trombonist J.J. Johnson and other young players who would become leaders of the next generation and part of Russell's network in New York City. After touring with Carter for only 6 months with engagements at Harlem's Apollo Theatre, in Chicago ballrooms and at the Howard Theatre in Washington, the tuberculosis weakened Russell was replaced by New Star drummer Max Roach in 1943. Prior to leaving, Russell contributed an original piece to Carter's band New World, making one of his first significant compositional commissions. Leaving Carter and feeling some disenchantment with his own drumming, Russell worked in Chicago as musical director for pianist Earl Hines. For Hines, Russell wrote floor shows and worked at such clubs as El Grotto and Rumboogie. Excited by the developments in the modern jazz of Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker and Thelonious Monk, Russell moved to New York City in 1945. There he became acquainted with another recent arrival from the Midwest, the young Miles Davis. Davis was attending Juilliard by day and following Parker and Gillespie by night. Weakened from his illness, Russell was prevented from accepting work with Parker and others, but he was able to sell New World to Gillespie. Russell also sold New World to several other bands, including Cab Calloway, although no recordings or scores of this work are known to exist. After a near-fatal collapse, Russell was taken to the infamous Bellevue Hospital, where he was near enough to death that a priest was brought in to give him his last rites. After 3 weeks there, a 15-month stay in St. Joseph's Hospital from 1946 to 47 led Russell to investigate further harmonic possibilities at the piano and to search for a scale that was closer to the sound of the chord than any other. The basis for the Lydian Chromatic concept was formed at an old piano in the lounge where the patients in the sanatorium would congregate to relax, socialise and smoke. Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Max Roach and J.J. Johnson visited Russell during his time at St. Joseph's. Even earlier, Davis, who already knew something of Russell's theoretical ambitions, had spoken with him about wanting to learn all the changes, and Davis's eagerness to find a deeper way to understand chords and scales remained a strong inspiration behind the development of the Lydian Chromatic concept. Upon his release from St. Joseph's, Russell stayed with Max Roach and his wife for 9 months in Brooklyn, and during this time of recuperation he composed and developed his harmonic theories further. Parker, Gillespie, Davis and John Lewis were frequent visitors at the Roach apartment at this time, 1947-48. The result of this intuitive investigation into music theory led to Russell's return to activity as a composer and arranger. From 1947 to 1949, he composed a series of notable pieces in the history of big band composition. For Gillespie's exciting bebop and Latin-influenced big band, he collaborated with Gillespie and Chanzo Pozzo on legendary Cubana B and Cubana Bop, which fused Afro-Cuban rhythms, 20th century European modernism and big band jazz. This landmark pair and an early arrangement of Parker's Relaxing at Camarillo that used polymodality and rhythm in a similar fashion were premiered in the December 1947 Carnegie Hall concert that also featured Charlie Parker and Ella Fitzgerald. In 1949 came the ever more strikingly original A Bird in Igor's Yard, recorded by the Buddy DeFranco Orchestra. This piece stands as Russell's greatest early work, fusing elements of Parker and Igor Stravinsky with Russell's bold and brassy approach to big band music. He also contributed arrangement to the Artie Shaw Orchestra and the Charlie Ventura Orchestra. Russell also composed the Tristano-like bebop theme, Aesthetic, during this time, commissioned by Lee Konitz, who was then lead alto saxophone with the Claude Thornhill Orchestra, but was moving towards a small group bebop orientation, and dedicated to the great Cincinnati boxer Ezzard Charles. An arrangement of Aesthetic was also made for Parker to play with the then ongoing Charlie Parker with Strings project, which began in November of 1949 with recordings and performances at Birdland. However, either producer Norman Granz or Parker's manager Teddy Reg discouraged Parker from recording Russell's arrangement or any other bebop pieces, preferring the arrangements of popular standards. Also, in 1949, Russell received encouragement in his theoretical work from lifelong colleague and friend John Lewis, pianist and co-founder of the Modern Jazz Quartet. Russell turned his attention away from more commercial big band arranging and began to work exclusively on his theory, taking a job at Macy's to support himself. On the advice of Gil Evans, Russell took composition lessons privately with German expatriate composer Stefan Wolf. Wolf's ability to borrow a range of sophisticated influences without becoming a slave to any system, coupled with his emphasis on creativity, shares much in common with Russell's developing identity as a self-made intuitive theorist who is not a member of any one school and who approaches composition as his own personal odyssey. In 1951, Konitz recorded Aesthetic and Ad Hina with a sextet for Bob Weinstock's New Jazz label. The second piece was a Russell original named for his first wife, artist Juanita Adhina, later Juanita Anida Giuffre, after she married Jimmy Giuffre. Konitz's sextet featured bebop stars Miles Davis and Max Roach, with three players of the so-called Lenny Tristano school, Billy Bauer, Sal Mosca and Arnold Fishkin. These sextet sides featured the same instrumentation, alto saxophone, trumpet, guitar, piano, bass drums, as the later Jazz Workshop recordings from 1956. This indicates that Russell was working with a sextet combination as early as 5 years before his debut album was recorded featuring that same instrumentation. Russell completed and copyrighted the first edition of his Lydian Chromatic concept in 1953. Publishing it as a simple mimeograph in notebook binding. He made only a few copies and did not attempt to distribute the work widely. No library has a copy of this original first edition, nor did Russell himself in later years. His second wife, Alice Russell, has said that Dave Gard, founder of the Kingston Trio, helped Russell with the cost of self-publishing the second edition in 1959, and that Gord owned a copy of the 1953 version at the time of his death in 1991. And so this takes us up to the date of the publication of the Lydian Chromatic concept.